Your Excellencies, Reverend and Eminence, yes, Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, friends in Christ, I will not be offended if you take a nice nap during this talk. In fact, I might do the same if I get a chair, because it's, after to speak after such a good lunch, it's quite a task. In my first presentation on previous Friday, I have been talking about the diabolical aspects of the modern mentality, the spirit of enlightenment, the modern revolution and its challenges to Catholics around the globe. Today I want to focus on one particular aspect of that revolution, which has to do with human sexuality and family, namely the population control. Obviously, we cannot understand that phenomenon of population control without mentioning first the sexual revolution of the 20th century. In the May issue 2006 of a magazine called Chronicles, its editor-in-chief, Thomas Fleming, has a very interesting essay on the results of the sexual revolution. I'll quote from that article, which is titled "New Wine in Old Bottles." He writes that, quote, "The revolution that made us who we are began during the Great Revolt against Christianity, known as Renaissance, and it entered an acute phase with the French Revolution. Although it has taken many forms and aimed at so varied a set of targets, it has hardly deviated from its most basic goal, the liberation of what one of the most virulent revolutionaries termed the libido." Yes, it is the liberalization of libido which serves as a means of the modern revolution, tearing down the Catholic social order. When Our Lady warned in Fatima against the errors of Russia, was she also speaking about errors related to the sphere of human sexuality? She might have had it in her mind, as it was the communist Russia, Soviet Union, which was the very first country to legalize abortion and openly promote contraception and other sins against the Sixth Commandment. The first few years of the Bolshevik Revolution, we have seen a frontal assault on the senses, unleashing a truly libertine spirit, which is in the line of the thought of one of the founders of Marxism, the friend and colleague of Marx himself, Friedrich Engels, who devoted a whole book on the necessity of destroying the family as the cornerstone of Christendom and civilization, was calling for the liberation of women from the yoke of the family, from the tyranny of man. And many later revolutionaries just didn't do anything else than just furthered Engels' thought and accustomed to it just for the modern times. But the West, under the influence of Enlightenment ideas, the liberalism, had also brought about a great assault on family, on Christian moral teaching, through the legalization of divorce and contraception, which was later eased by the separation of state from the church. And today, we are witnessing a worldwide dissemination of this particular error of Russia and very little opposition to it. But is the liberalization of the libido only a natural fruit of hedonistic ethics, or is there something even more sinister about it? Obviously, hedonism is a part of that picture, because it's a natural product of a rejection of metaphysics in the ethical thought. When human behavior is not regulated by objective moral norms that can be discovered and known by human beings, then it will be the senses that will take over the reason and will dominate them. Hedonistic ethics is one of the many poison fruits of enlightenment. With its perverted notion of freedom in the sense of license, which is a right to do whatever you want to do. Sexual liberation didn't start in the 1960s. The decade only represents the climax of forces unleashed many decades before. The well-known American author E. Michael Jones, in his book Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control, makes a strong and well-documented case for the following scenario. The liberalization of human sexuality during and after the breakdown of Christendom is a conscious and orchestrated act on the part of those who want to use it as a means to control the masses. The materialistic philosophy of modernity gave birth to the naked will, emancipated from the transcendentally founded moral norms. But materialism cannot inspire. And the problem of how to control man and direct society in the absence of traditional moral restraints remained. Libido Dominandi is in large part an exposure of the intellectual dishonesty of modernity, beginning with the idea that sexual liberation means freedom. On the contrary, sexual liberation has meant and continues to mean an enormous increase in the power of government, ruled by moneyed elites, an ever-increasing escalation of subliminal control. There are only two options, Jones writes. Either you control yourself according to the moral law, or your passions control you, or someone controls you through the manipulation of your passions. Close quote. There is either the rule of reason and self-control, or there is the sexual revolution and tyranny. The modern regime knows this and exploits this situation to its own advantage. In other words, sexual freedom is in fact a form of social control, a way of maintaining the regime in power by exploiting the passions of those who then identify with the regime, which ostensibly enables them to gratify these passions. Given this fact, it should come as no surprise that the Enlightenment's major proponent of sexual liberation should also be the first to describe sex as a form of political control. I'm talking here about Marquis de Sade, who was a prisoner in the Bastille in the summer of 1789, writing pornographic novels and growing fat from the food he paid to have brought in. Beginning in July, he fashioned a primitive megaphone out of a piece of paper and incited the mob outside the prison to storm it and liberate him and the 6 other people there. That was the start of the famous French Revolution. His later novels, written during the time of revolution, explain that if the revolutionary republic wants to win over Christendom, the passions of men must be fully liberated so that they can bring down the social order. The potential for both control and insurrection undergo a fundamental change when sexuality is deregulated and allowed to act as a stimulant for perpetual unrest. In fact, since the revolutionary regime is based on the subversion of morals, it can only exist by exploiting sexuality in this fashion. What it proposes to the mob as freedom is really only a form of social and political control. So it is also from this angle that we should view the legalization of pornography, which is not just some sort of unfortunate byproduct of the revolutionary regime that must be tolerated if we all want to enjoy the freedom of expression. It's the argument that the liberals express around the globe. Pornography is the essence of a revolutionary political regime, because it is only by managing the passions of the citizens that it maintains its control over them. In gratifying the illicit desires, it evokes the gratitude of slaves and creates out of that gratitude political control. Okay, so what has this to do with the population control, which is the main focus of my talk? Population control is a regime-orchestrated program of birth regulation through the means of sexual liberation. The control of the number of births is only possible when you disrupt and pervert the end of human sexuality, which is procreation, make the passions the king over one's body and soul. Population control is thus the sine qua non of the New World Order, about which Cornelia Ferreira spoke yesterday. This is a quotation from a New Age luminary, Marilyn Ferguson. For the first time in history, Ferguson says, humanity has access to the control panel of change, to the understanding of the manner in which transformations are produced. The paradigm of the Aquarian conspiracy conceives humanity as rooted in nature and encourages the autonomous individual in a society by considering us as stewards of all our resources, interior and exterior. It sees us as heirs of evolution's riches, capable of imagination, invention, and experiences which we have but still only glimpsed, close quote. Change, novelty, transformation, evolution. We all know these terms as the code words of our modern regime. Based on the dogmas of modern philosophy, there is no fixed human nature. There is nothing that defines humanity and the purpose of human life independently of time, culture, local customs. Human life, man, is just one element in the pantheistic continuum of the evolutionary process. This is the ideological source of the culture of death. Abortion, contraception, embryo experimentation, in vitro fertilization, but also about phenomena like gender policing, feminism, or unisex clothing, and of course of eugenically inspired population control. Since its creation in 1945, when it replaced the Vatican as an international arbitrator of influence, the United Nations has become the seat of a future one-world government. And the sine qua non of this world collectivist state is total control of the world's people. It is thus no mere coincidence that within 1 month of the establishment of the UN's Economic and Social Council in the spring of 1945, the United Nations established a population commission to collect demographic data and to study demographic relationships to economic and social factors. Powerful New Age influences were seeded into all the UN specialized and interconnected UN agencies, including the International Labour Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNESCO, World Health Organization, UNICEF, the World Bank. All of them are institutional subscribers to the ideology of overpopulation. This new paradigm is not at all restricted to these supranational organizations. They dominate the power centers of many nation states as well. They work shoulder to shoulder in making this new paradigm the political and legal framework of the whole world. The reason they enforce programs of population control, conditioning humanitarian and development aid to poorer countries, is not only to curb the numbers of the less affluent or allegedly backward. The eugenic programs of population control were from the very beginning inspired by overt racism, but mainly as a means of political and social control. The powers are aware of the fact that population growth is an asset, after all, not a liability, and they feel threatened, both politically and militarily, because of the growing confrontation between the affluent but dying West and the so-called underdeveloped countries with much higher birth rate. So after having caused the population dearth in the Western countries through the sexual liberation movement, the regime of enlightenment needs to undermine the population growth in other countries to keep the global power structures balanced. It is out of the fear that those nations or cultures that do not follow the ideological plan of enlightenment might overpopulate the nations that succumb to the Darwinian mentality that the idea of population control was born. In its initial years, it was known as the eugenic movement. But because Hitler gave it a bad name, after the Second World War, the Eugenic Society was renamed for Planned Parenthood. The International Planned Parenthood was, before the Second World War, named the Eugenic Society. But the goals of that organization remain the same. Only some of the means have changed. The same people that supported and financed the eugenics program captured the means of communication and started to portray demographic control as concern for health and freedom. To what degree, we should ask ourselves, are the Catholics, the contemporary Catholics, seduced by this false and dangerous call to curb the demographic growth? As we all know, the Church always fought against this Manichaean distaste of procreation, calling unto Catholics to be generous in giving life to new human beings. As Pius XII stated in his address in 1958, quote, "Wherever you find large families in great numbers, they point to the physical and moral health of a Christian people, a living faith in God, and trust in His providence, the fruitful and joyful holiness of Catholic marriage." Close quote. Large family was a synonym of a Catholic family during the pontificate of Pius XII, but much earlier. But the 1960s brought about a change. The social upheaval represented by the sexual revolution was so pervasive that even the Catholic Church got tainted with it. Even though the famous encyclical of Paul VI, Humanae Vitae, issued in 1968, did retain the traditional teaching against artificial contraception, this encyclical is concerned about population growth and takes that problem very seriously. That's why the subtitle of this encyclical is about the regulation of birth. Not about large families or being open to life, but about regulation of birth. Humanae Vitae rightly differentiates between contraception as intrinsically immoral practice and the use of what is today called the natural family planning, or periodic abstinence as it was called before. But the promotion of natural family planning, NFP, in the more conservative Catholic circles, I mean, the liberals, they use contraception anyway, they are not interested in NFP. But among the conservative Catholics, sometimes, or perhaps most of the times, are dangerously flawed. Married or engaged couples are often taught the legitimacy and techniques of how to avoid birth, but without little or no mention that this practice is licit only if there are just and grave reasons for limiting the conjugal acts of a married couple to the infertile period. Very often, such couples are not being told by the pastors or NFP teachers that the sacred scripture and the church's teachings see in large families a sign of God's blessing and the parents' generosity. Still less frequently are they taught that, according to the magisterium, merely temporal or worldly considerations are in themselves inadequate criteria for deciding when NFP can be justified. Thus it frequently happens that the contraceptive mentality prevailing in our modern societies penetrate the NFP courses to the spiritual disadvantage of the Catholic couples. As a proof to what I'm saying, just look into any of the NFP publication that's being used in the English or the Czech-speaking world. I have to admit that the former is a bit larger than the latter, so I assume that you would rather search in the English literature, but both in the English and Czech you will find, and in most cases, somewhere already on the first pages of the book, an assurance that NFP is at least as effective as the use of artificial contraception for the regulation of birth. Okay, so that's the starting motivation of how to get the people, the Catholics, interested on how to limit the number, how to space the children, through the comparison with the artificial contraception. How was the change of mentality, the change from openness towards life to avoid birth for no serious reason, achieved? Well, we have to understand that it was the Catholic Church which was the biggest obstacle to the population control programs and their success worldwide. The Church and its teachings on procreation had to be attacked. And the most efficient way how to attack Church's teaching is through the Catholics themselves. The revolutionaries desperately needed some well-known Catholics who would work on the change of the mentality from within the Catholic structures. Behind the population eugenic project, you find names famous for what is called philanthropy. The Rockefeller family, the Ford Foundation, and a couple of other well-known financiers of the modern revolution. That you most probably know. You are aware of their existence and their work. But do you know that it was these pockets that feeded a Catholic obstetrician, Dr. John Rock, in his successful effort in manufacturing the pill? Yes, the pill is an invention of a Catholic doctor. Rock studied the function, timing, and chemical triggers for ovulation and conception. His work led to a clearer understanding of the cycles of fertility, which provided a foundation for the development of the rhythm method of birth control. In 1939, he founded the first rhythm clinic in the United States for patients at the Boston Free Hospital for Women. John Rock made clear that his rhythm clinic was intended to benefit infertile women by allowing them to identify the best time for conception. His intention, in time when he started this work, was to help couples to achieve pregnancy, not to avoid it. His work overlapped with that of Gregory Pincus, another Boston researcher who was testing the effect of progesterone on rabbits. At this point, however, Pincus and Rock had different goals. Pincus was seeking not to increase the likelihood of conception, but to prevent it. He wanted to develop a pill that would stop ovulation in humans. In 1951, Margaret Sanger, a long-time crusader for birth control, a fervent socialist and feminist, introduced Gregory Pincus to Catherine McCormick, a wealthy widow who was committed to the birth control cause. Catherine McCormick gave Pincus a check for $40,000 to advance his work. She would eventually contribute over $1 million to support research that was too controversial for conventional funding sources. Pincus had a problem, however. Since he was not a licensed physician, he could not legally conduct drug trials. He thought of collaborating with his fellow Bostonian, John Rock, Catholic. He knew Rock had experienced some success using hormone treatments to control the timing and frequency of ovulation in infertile women. In 1952, Gregory Pincus asked John Rock to work with him to make the treatment effective as an oral contraceptive. Dr. Rock was in his 60s and approaching retirement when Pincus made his controversial proposal. Because he believed so deeply by then in the need for world population control, John Rock agreed. He was given the money from the Rockefeller Foundation and invented the pill and got it into the market. This tragic story has no happy end. Not only that with the help of a Catholic, the plague of contraceptive mentality was furthered, but Rock himself lapsed and died as an apostate. Nevertheless, his direct involvement in producing the contraceptive pill had a serious mental impact on the Catholic population. The sexual revolution of the 1960s was, we can fairly say, a demographic attack, not only against the so-called less developed countries, nations around the globe, but against Catholics as well. And it was so successful that within a decade or two, it effectively neutralized the only effective opposition to the eugenic regime, the Catholic Church. As we all know today, the population bomb scenario was false. Not only that there is no real population growth problem. What is becoming a serious problem, at least in the Western countries, is the lack of births, not their excess. Just recently, the European Union has sounded the alarm on their dangerously low birth rate, which will result in a 20 million worker shortage by as early as 2030. There were no European countries with fertility rates of less than 1.3 children per woman in 1990. By 2002, there were 15, while 6 more were below 1.4. No European country is maintaining its population through births now. And only France, with a rate of 1.8, has even the potential to do so. The former Soviet bloc countries have experienced marked reductions in birth rates during the last decade, with an alarming 1.2 children average per woman in my country, in Slovenia, Latvia, Catholic Poland, lower even than Western Europe's record-setting Spain, Greece, and Italy, which have all had 1.3 births per woman for at least a decade. Never in the last 650 years, since the time of the Black Plague, have birth and fertility rates fallen so far, so fast, so low, for so long, in so many places. Let us think for a while. What does it mean when we say that there is too many people? Well, that means that there is someone, a group or a whole nation, which is superfluous. They would be better if he, she, or they would not live. This attitude is a product of a materialistic mindset. Well, it's true that human beings affect one another's lives, sometimes helpfully, sometimes harmfully, so we cannot regard our numbers with a distant detachment. Well, they matter. But what about rats? There are too many rats when they militate against the human well-being, right? Can we use that same phrase in case of people? That would enable some people to claim private primacy over other people, just as man claims primacy over animals. And that's precisely the spirit of the population growth conferences organized by UN and on national levels. What is between the lines? What is the message of these conferences? That there are some nations that breed like rats and that they militate against the well-being of those affluent, childless, hedonistic elites of the Enlightenment regimes. The population control ideology reduces the worth of human life merely to material productivity and efficiency. And that is how the quality of life is measured, by the degree of utility for the society. This is a quote from a famous book on population growth. Limits to Growth is the title of that book, by Dennis Meadows, who speaks clearly. Quote, "The crux of the matter is not only whether the human race will survive, but even more whether it can survive without falling into a state of worthless existence." Close quote. We are so humanistic that instead of allowing someone to live in such a state of a worthless existence, we will do everything to prevent he ever lives. The fact that he does not exist is better for him. So nothingness is better than being in this perverted world of Manichaean modernity. One more thing might be said here. We have heard from other speakers about the spiritual malfunctions that are caused by the spirit of the worldliness that infected the church in our times. Even Cardinal Ratzinger, in his interview book with Vittorio Messori, attests to the fact that the period after the Second Vatican Council didn't bring the expected reinvigoration of the church, but chaos. So instead of multiplying the graces that flow, we face a situation in which this flow of graces has been blocked. There are obstacles that are put into the flow of graces. Lack of prayer, lack of proper liturgy, and the sins against the commandments, the sixth among them. That's the one that we are dealing right now in this talk. The diabolical disorientation about which Sister Lucy spoke. That means there are fewer graces penetrating into the hearts of the baptized flock. Why do I say that in a presentation on population control? Well, there is a relation between the degree or intensity of the supernatural life of the soul and the perfections or virtues of natural life. And vice versa, grace builds on nature. Where nature, as God intended, is not followed, the seed of the supernatural life has little chance to grow into maturity. The liberal, the ecumenically minded changes brought about by the Second Vatican Council reforms are to the supernatural life what contraception is to the natural life of a family. Sins and wrongdoing have consequences. Population dearth and the economic hardship that we are all going to face pretty soon is one of them. But what is much worse is the spiritual price that we are paying. The lack of children in our societies reflects the lack of trust in God's own providence and consequently a growing detachment from our Creator and Redeemer and the order of salvation. What we as Catholics must do is to wage war against the contraceptive mentality that plagues our age. Let's separate ourselves from the spirit of times and be counter-revolutionary in being open to life, trusting in God and Our Lady, who loves each and every child, for whom there is no immortal soul that is unwanted. Thank you.